My name is Peter Jamieson. I was born in 1967 in Lerwick, Shetland. Grew up there, lived there till I was roughly about 20 years old, and then I moved away to Aberdeen. My upbringing in Shetland was quite a pleasant one. I had two lovely parents who were quite elderly really when I was born. They already had a son and daughter who were quite considerably older than me. And my upbringing was such that, I was quite a troublesome little boy. I was always in a lot of trouble, especially living, I suppose, down around the docks area in Lerwick. We always, it was such a lot to do. It was a place full of boats and sheds and all sorts, and we just got up to all sorts of mischief down there. But I was forever in trouble, or I seemed to be forever in trouble with the police. By the time I was 12 years old, I'd been in front of the children's panel twice. They were talking about, at one time they were talking about a reform school for me somewhere on the mainland. But thankfully, that never happened. But I was a very troublesome young boy, and I caused a lot of trouble for my family, especially with the police coming to the door the whole time. And it did take its toll on my parents, my dad especially, because he wasn't a well man all my younger days. And so, it did cause problems. But things, I suppose, got better for me in my teens in respect to the trouble I got into. But of course, when I was 13, 14, I discovered the joys of alcohol, and before long, I discovered the joys of drugs. So, from quite a young age, I suppose, my early teens, I embarked on what was to be a 25-year life of addiction to drugs, to alcohol, and interspersed with periods of crime. And that was the course my life took as a result of that. But at the age of 17, 18, I was very involved in drugs at a bigger level. I was dealing drugs in Shetland at that time. I was well known. I became quite well known amongst drug users, and of course I became quite well known to the authorities. At the age of 20, 21 I think, it ended up with a drugs raid on my mum and dad's house, which at that time was the last straw, shall we say, of a family who had, up until that point, had tried to support me as best they could through my troubled years of addiction to drink and drugs. I moved to Aberdeen at that point. I would have been about 21 years old, and the idea of moving to Aberdeen really was to, if I'm honest, it was to get away from the people who cared about me, so that I could carry on and do the things I wanted to do without hurting them, without them seeing me. Of course, trying to take up my drug dealing career in Aberdeen had its problems for the offset. I wasn't very popular among other dealers in the town, and so life wasn't particularly easy, and it didn't go well. So I kind of gave it up after maybe a year. But I carried on drinking and I carried on drugging because that was just who I was. And I did a little bit of dealing on the side, but of course I tried to live a normal life in a sense. I got a job in a bar, followed by a job in a butchery superstore, as I'd kind of had some experience in butchery. But drugs and drink were always a problem for me. I was always getting into trouble with my employers. I was always getting warnings. And then of course I started on other drugs such as heroin. And that really, at the age I think probably about 28, 29, I'd been a heroin addict. I'd been on various methadone programs. And so my experience of drugs at that time had got fully worse. I'd been heroin addiction had been off and on for a few years. Struggled with that and ended up on methadone. But it was in 1999, at the age of 30, 29, 30 I think it was, I got a call from Shetland to say, that my dad was dying of cancer, and shortly afterwards he did die. And that was a bit hard for me at that time. I came home to Shetland to see my family. I'd been in Aberdeen by this time for a number of years, and we had very little dealings with one another at this point. And it did something in me at that time. It made me re-examine myself and the years that I've wasted. And so I kind of made a promise at that time, perhaps to try and better myself. But instead, when I got back to Aberdeen, things just got fully worse. I got very involved in cocaine and dealing cocaine. I met in with gangsters, I suppose, from Liverpool and from Glasgow, who supplied me with various drugs. And so my drugs use escalated. I became a cocaine addict. I was a crack addict for many years. And all the time, I was drinking. So my life was just chaotic. For 7 years, from 1999 through to 2006, my life was chaotic, to say the least. I was drinking and drugging every day, trying to make money for these people who were supplying me drugs, and forever in and out of various degrees of debt, getting myself into all sorts of trouble. And so in 2006, after a stormy 7 years of crack and cocaine addiction, I ended up attempting to take my life and took an overdose. It's not the first time I have taken an overdose. I've done it many times in the past, especially when I've been injecting drugs. I've quite often taken drugs with a hope that I might not wake up. It maybe was never a proper attempt as such, but I've always used drugs to the extent that, when I've taken them, I've taken massive amounts and haven't, just not caring if I ever woke up for that. And so in 2006, that attempt, it landed me in hospital in Aberdeen. This was 17 years, I suppose, after leaving Shetland. I found myself in the ARI in Aberdeen, being checked over by these nurses after having taken an overdose. But it was just shortly after this I returned home to this flat that I was living in at the time with a friend of mine, and I sat on the edge of this bed, just sort of looking at my life and how it had been, disgusted with myself for what had just happened. And here I was, an addict, never seemed to be able to break the chain of things. And I did something at that point I'd never really done before. I remember there was this young man who used to come into the pub quite a lot, and he was a Christian. He used to tell me about Jesus. And so I sat there on this bed and I says, well, okay, if there is such a person, if there is such a thing as God, then please will you help me? And it was at that point a thought came to my head to go home to Shetland and to see my family for help. The only person, my father had been dead by this time, as I said, for 7 years. My mother was in a home I knew with Alzheimer's, and so I didn't really have many people to turn to apart from my sister, who'd always been there for me as a child. She more or less brought me up as a child, and so I took a chance on going home to see her, to see if she would open her door to me and help me. And so I did. I came back to Shetland. That was in 2006. So when I came to see my sister then, she opened the door to me, thankfully, and she welcomed me. Well, she took me in. She heard what I had to say, and she saw how the state of me. At that time, I was about 9.5 stone in weight. I had a yellowy complexion from hepatitis C that I'd had for years of sharing needles, and I wasn't well physically or mentally. But she took a chance on me. She saw how desperate I was, and so she took me in and helped me to get some appointments with various drugs agencies in Lerwick. I was taken on by CADS, which is a local community drugs agency, and they got me onto a detox program. From the detox program, I then went to see doctors about my physical condition. The hepatitis C was diagnosed. Therefore, they set up a program for me to receive help for the hepatitis C. But in the meantime, I still had a major issue with addiction that had to be addressed, and so it was put to me to go and visit a rehab in Shetland called the Papastour Project. Now, this was a Christian organisation, in Papastour. And so I went there to spend some time with these people to try and see if something could finally be done about my addictions, because I'd been on many programs in the past. Nothing had ever worked for me. Everything had failed. And so I went to this rehab, and almost on entering the door, I was greeted by these people, Andy and Sabina, who run the rehab, who introduced me, I suppose, to the Bible. And because it was Christian at its core, the teaching and the program, I was expected at least to engage in the reading of the Bible in these programs. So I took the Bible with the hope in my heart that it would help me. And so I wasn't, I didn't push it away. I kind of welcomed it. I said, well, I'm willing to try anything at this point. The only person I had left in the world was my sister. That's how I felt anyway. And I thought, I wanted to do this. If I couldn't do this for my folks, or for the way I'd lived my life, trying to make up for it, I could at least try and do it for her. So I engaged in this Christian program and started to read the Bible. A week or so into this program there, I was reading the Bible, and and there was a few things that really spoke to me. The first was in John's Gospel, chapter 3. It talks about the condition of people. God says, that the hearts of men are dark. That people live in darkness. We walk in darkness. We dwell in darkness, and our hearts are dark, sinful things. And so right away in that passage, I recognized me. I thought, well, that is me. That's how I've lived my life. I've lived my life very much in darkness. I've been very filled with darkness, I feel. I've never had hope for anything my whole life. I've never achieved anything really worthwhile. It's all been very negative and destructive. And so in that chapter, I saw me. A little later, I got to John chapter 8, verse 12. And as I read that, I thought, well, chapter 3 showed me who I was. And so when I was reading the Bible, trying to figure out, well, what do I do about this, I discovered John chapter 8, verse 12, where it says, where Jesus says, whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And when I read that, I thought, well, okay, I see what you're saying here, but how on earth do I follow you? Who are you for me to follow? And so I read on, and it was only when I got to chapter 20, 19 and 20, when I read about Jesus' death and his resurrection, that I understood who he was and what God had done. That Jesus had paid with his life for my sin, for my past, for everything that I'd done. He had taken it upon himself and gone upon a cross and given his life so that I could be forgiven, so that I could be reconciled into this family that God has for us, for me, and that I could begin my life again. And I realized at that point, that if this is true, if Jesus is real, and if he has been raised from the dead, then there's hope for me. And so at that point, I prayed out. I said, God, if you're real, if this is true, and you raised Christ from the dead, I says, please, 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 will you help me? And as I said that prayer, I could see my life almost flashing before my eyes, in a sense, knowing the kind of person I'd been. And I sort of cried out, in my heart, I sort of thought, well, why would God want to help such a person as me? And I really just cried out for forgiveness. I said, I will turn from my wicked ways, from the ways that I've lived my life, and I will follow you, more or less. And at that point, I went to sleep. I went to my little bed, and that night I had a dream. I had a dream in which Jesus came to me, and he spoke with me. And there was obviously things in my heart which needed to be dealt with. And that encounter with Christ changed everything for me. When I woke up for that dream, I knew there and then that my life would never be the same again. Everything had changed for me at that point, and I knew what I had to do was to rebuild my life and to build it on the foundation of Jesus as my Lord and Saviour. And that's what I did. And that was 6.5 years ago, nearly 7 years ago. And I've been a Christian since then. And life has been very different. When I finally left the rehab, I left there with a desire to live a completely different life. That desire, I believe, is something that God gave me. It's not something that I've ever had before, because my expectations in the past always ended in disaster. If I ever had any hopes and dreams to do something, they were never fulfilled. They were never completed. My experiences have led me never to expect anything good out of life. But now I seem to have this desire to live a completely different life, and to be able to, freely and confidently have a hope that things would be different for me. I began, first of all, I suppose, by attending a local Christian church. I got to know some lovely people. It was new to me, becoming a Christian and going to church. It took a little while for me to settle into it, but I had some amazing encounters through the Holy Spirit, through the reading of the Word, through through these things, and I felt strengthened week by week by week. I could feel myself getting stronger. I could feel myself developing as a person, as a Christian. And therefore, I could sense that this excitement, that life was just going to be so much better. Within a few weeks of leaving the rehab, I started working, and I got a job in a salmon factory. I was working up in a little area called Sand, not far from the place here in Scalway where I live. I worked with them for nearly 3 years. The factory actually moved here to Scalway, which was quite handy for me because I was living here. I moved here at that time, and but I still had issues at the time to deal with. One of them was the hepatitis C. I had chronic hepatitis C, which the doctor reckoned I could have had from anything up to possibly 15, 16 years from when I started injecting drugs. They put me on a program, which thankfully was successful. It was a 6-month chemotherapy treatment, which I had to undergo, and it was successful. In fact, it was successful after only a few weeks. I was told that the virus had disappeared, which came as a great surprise to me and many others. But I was completely cleared of hepatitis C, and it was shortly after that. Well, 3 years nearly of working in the salmon factory. It wasn't a place I ever thought I would work, but I enjoyed it. But I really felt God calling me to do something more with my life, or to look at least to pursue a career perhaps more worthwhile. And I suppose one of the biggest regrets I have in my life is the relationship I had with my family. My dad dying, when he did, one of the things I always hoped I'd be able to do one day would be able to say sorry to him for the life I'd given him. My mum, by the time I got back to Shetland, was in a home with Alzheimer's disease, so she had no idea who I was. And so neither of those two people, the two people I love most in this life, I suppose, neither of them got to see the change me. They'd only ever known me as really a drunken and addict since I was a teenage boy up until my 30s. And so this was something, and I suppose I regret it, definitely, but I wanted somehow to do something that would, in a sense, make amends. And so I really felt God calling me one day to work in a care home right next door to my house. It was a place I've seen every day. When I opened my curtains, I would see this care home full of elderly people. I would see the staff coming and going nearly every day, and I would always wonder what went on in that building, what kind of people were in there. And as I kind of grew in my Christian life and read more in Scripture, I felt God calling me. why don't you go in there and get an application form and at least apply for a job, because there's something in there for you. At that time, I had no idea that I could do anything of that nature. In fact, it terrified me to think that I could go in and work with elderly people. But I went in one day, I asked for an application form, I took it home and I filled it out. It didn't take very long, mind you, because I had absolutely no experiences to put in there worthwhile. I had no qualifications from school. In fact, I was kicked out of school at 15. And I thought, well, I'll stick this in. I don't know if they'll take it on board, because there's nothing really here of any value to an employer. And I stuck it in there, but it's a Church of Scotland home. And within 1 week of putting in my application form, I got a phone call from a lovely lady called Janice Smith, who invited me across for an interview. I went across for an interview, and within 2 months, they had agreed to take me on not as a carer, but as an assistant in the day centre. And that's where I began 5 years ago now, nearly 5 years ago now. I began in the Walter and Joan Gray as a care assistant in the day centre. And in that time I have progressed to where I'm now a duty senior in the residential area of the home. But from the first day working in the home, you know, I felt this love that I never really knew was in me. And it was a love for people who I didn't know, these elderly people who would come to the home. And there I felt God saying to me, now Peter, now you can pay, you can give something back. You know, I'm giving you an opportunity here to show the love that you had for your mum and dad but weren't able to give. You can give it here. And it's been a tremendous thing for me. It has been such a blessing on my life. I never knew I could be this person. I never knew, to be honest, I never really understood love. I don't think I've ever really understood what love is, what it meant to be in love, my whole life, until I had an encounter with Jesus, who showed me what love was on the cross. And then again, as he has led me and guided me through this life, not once ever failing me, but blessing me in so many ways that I am now in a position now where I can show that love to others, which again is such a wonderful gift. It is something I believe God has just blessed me with, and it's it's wonderful. Life is very good.